Welcome to the American Diversity Report podcast, where we interview diverse movers and shakers and wonderful change makers. I'm Deborah Levine, your host and editor of the American Diversity Report. And with me today is Maralee McClean, who is a child advocate, protective parent, domestic violence expert witness, professional speaker, and author addressing the problem of family courts not protecting abused children. Welcome, Maralee.
Well, thank you, Deborah, for having me on your show. I'm looking forward to it, very much so.
Oh, it's a pleasure. You're taking on some very difficult issues, child abuse and courts, and the difficulty in getting the correct justice for them. Tell me how you got into this arena.
Well, actually, Deborah, I'm a protective parent, protective mom, and what I want to state briefly to your audience or who's listening is that there are thousands and thousands of these cases, and I was involved over 25 years ago. I tried to protect my daughter from sexual abuse by her father in the family court, and I have full custody of her, so this was not a custody issue. He had very limited visitation, but sexual abuse was going on, and more time I spent trying to protect her in the system, the more time I lost with her. And I couldn't believe what was happening. And so the more there was doctor's reports, police reports, hospital reports stating she's being abused. And the judge was, and several judges did this, so ignored all evidence of the abuse. And I was in shock. So when I saw the system failing, I started writing. And I was afraid of my ex because he was a domestic violence abuser, which a lot of these men are, that move on to abuse the children. And I wanted to make sure I had everything documented and written down just in case something happened to me so that my daughter would have it. So really, my book started out as more of a documenting type thing. And so over the 20 years, I had so much documentation and proof of what was going on. And it's a pretty incredible book. I get really emotional stories in there that people say they read it in like 2 days. It's like 400 pages, but it's got all the research and the legal behind it to prove what's going on and what's happening in our system. So once I got involved, I began speaking and testifying before Congress and lobbying, and I turned over every rock to try to get my daughter back to freedom and safety out of the situation she was forced into by our family courts.
Oh, my goodness. And I understand you do a great deal of speaking. Is that correct?
Yes, I have. I speak. Well, what really started me, I started speaking at DU Law School many years ago. And I remember this professor asked me to speak to her class. And I said, oh, no, I'm not a speaker. She goes, oh, Maralee, you'd be great. And she wanted me to bring in parental alienation syndrome, which I know you and I will talk about later, and explain it to the law students of what was happening. And so I finally agreed to do it. It was a huge class. That was almost 200 students. And I was like, oh, great. But that's when I began speaking. And then rallies at the Capitol, and then I got in contact with several other mothers. Now, we didn't have the internet in my day, so you didn't have a way to get a hold of women like they do today. But today, these women are going back and forth on the internet, and there's so much information out there of what's happening. And back in my time, also, you weren't aware of domestic violence. To me, domestic violence meant you had to be beaten by a man, and I wasn't being beaten to death, but I was emotionally and physically abused. And the emotional abuse to me was the worst. And emotional abuse can be the worst with the coercive control, and you end up having PTSD and anxiety attacks, and you're living in a nightmare. But never do you believe it's going to go to the direction it's going to go, that our family courts are going to protect those women and those children, and they are not being protected. I get calls every day from all across the United States and internationally with the exact same stories. When I testify before Congress, I testify with 10 other mothers. These are good, loving moms. They're lawyers, doctors from every walk of life. It doesn't matter where you're coming from. You're going to lose because the system is not there to protect the children.
You testified before Congress. When was that?
Oh, that would have been right after I lost my daughter. Long story here. I fought in the court system. He started abusing her at 2.5. And the daycare provider brought it to my attention, and she ended up going to a doctor, and the doctor reported it to social services, and that's where all the investigations started. But it's a long story. The GAL, which is a guardian ad litem lawyer for the child, pushed for parental alienation syndrome, stating I had PAS. And I lost my little girl at the age of 5 with all the reports of evidence. I mean, there's tons of witnesses, her teacher, her preschool teacher, her daycare provider, police reports, as I said before, 3 police reports, 3 doctors' reports, 3 different hospital reports, children's hospital doctors in the state of Colorado, top doctors dealing as the sexual abuse with the Advocacy Center, wrote a letter to my judge, please contact us concerning the sexual abuse of this child, and he threw it out. My daughter ended up having to go live with her father, and I lost custody at that point. So that's right when I testified before Congress. I probably testified right around that time, so she was about 5. So I'd have to say it was maybe 1993 or so, or 92. And then I testified before Congress, and I realized I wasn't alone. I was out to continue to fight out here. But I lost my daughter to the abuser by 2 therapists that were in the state of Colorado that sided with the male, never looked at the abuse issue. There were over all these reports and witnesses, hundreds of witnesses, and they ignored it all and threw it out and said I had PAS. And that was the way they took my daughter away from me, labeled me with parental alienation syndrome. So I know what your next question is going to be. What is that, right?
Yes, thank you. Please explain to our audience more about the PAS, the program.
Okay. Well, Deborah, the parental alienation syndrome started in the early 80s, and there was a doctor by the name of Dr. Richard Gardner, and he self-published his books, and he sent them to every court in the nation, and everybody took on his theories. So all these women started losing custody due to PAS, which is not, it's debunked. It's not, as I said, it's not approved by the American Medical Association nor the American Psychological Association. However, it's still being used today, and a lot of these women are losing their children due to PAS, which is not even a real syndrome. And what it is, I'll give you a little bit more on that, is Dr. Richard Gardner, I went on CNN International News back in maybe 97 or so, and they did a full program on PAS, parental alienation syndrome, and had Richard Gardner on there. Incredible documentary on it. And he stated, jail these moms, gag these moms, put them in jail for the weekend. Well, these women are being jailed and gagged today. And these are not women that they're not drug addicts or alcoholics or sick in any way. They're just trying to protect their children, which that's what you're supposed to do as a mother or as a father too. But anyway, so he also states in his self-published book, we all have some pedophilia within us, that we need to have more pity for the pedophile than scorn, and it makes little boys and little girls better sexual partners. And this is very thick stuff. And he pushed that book, and so in it, obviously judges weren't reading what he really was entailing in those books, but that theory took hold, and that's why all these women started losing custody, and they are today too, still happening. So when I lost my daughter at the age of 5 to him, and I was pushed into supervised visits where I got to see her 1 hour a week, supervised, and anyway, they pretty much bankrupt you because these women go through so many court cases, and you're bankrupted by going to court all the time and then having to pay for supervised visit and watch your child suffer. And there's no grounds for it. You can't. I never did anything wrong. I abided by all their rules and orders. So it's a really sad situation. And a lot of these women never get their kids back. However, I did. So it took many years.
You got your child back, though, after many years?
Yeah, I lost her supervised visits for 8 years where I was treated as a hardened criminal. And I got to see her 1 hour a week, supervised in this little room, 8 by 10 feet. And she was never allowed. I have a beautiful family. I came from a great background. She couldn't see her grandparents, none of my family or my friends. Nobody that knew about the abuse. In other words, she was isolated and shut down and could not talk about it anymore. And even in the supervised visits, when she tried to tell me something, the supervisor would cut her off and not let her talk about it. So she was forced to shut down. And the trauma for her was not just the sexual abuse, but being taken from everybody that loved her. And everybody she told. This wasn't a child who was hiding it. She told policemen, doctors, social workers, psychologists, therapists, her teachers. She told everybody. And detailed stuff that no child could come up with. And to do that and then be forced to live with that abuser is beyond belief.
I'll say, my
So
goodness.
she was.
So this happened in the family court rather than criminal court, correct?
Right. What happens is these cases are within the family court. It's like your family, and that once and again, the best interest of the child is the parent is more able to nurture the relationship with the other parent. So obviously, those women go into court. They don't want to nurture that relationship. They just want that man out of the child's life because their children are suffering tremendously, or their child is. Rather than look at all the evidence, because family court's not an evidentiary hearing, judges have discretionary rule whether they can allow that evidence in or throw it out. Most of these cases, the evidence is getting thrown out. These cases belong in criminal court. And criminal court would prosecute. Like in my case, if the DA had prosecuted, then my daughter would have been protected. The DA, in my case, was waiting for the lower court to do a ruling and see what that lower court judge does. And he said, and if that judge takes that child from you, Maralee, we will step in and do something. But he never did. So what I'm saying is the DAs are not prosecuting him, and family court is ignoring him and throwing out a lot of evidence and not protecting the child. They just, it's easier to believe that a woman is a vindictive ex-wife or that she's making this up than to believe that a father would molest his own daughter. But the bottom line is we know that most incest or most sexual abuse is not by the boogeyman behind the bush or the, stranger. It's within the family, and that we're not looking at that issue.
I see. And do you see that there is a tendency, a trend, perhaps, in a better direction, or is this still on?
To me, Deborah, this is the last taboo. When I look at the Me Too movement and Time's Up and all the sexual assault on TV that we're seeing now, and these are grown women. And can you imagine being a child trying to protect yourself and finding a whole system of all the people that are professionals that tell you they're there to help you and protect you and don't? It's 10 zillion times worse as far as I'm concerned. An adult woman has, I don't believe in any kind of assault, anything to do with it, but it's part of the Me Too movement. This is part of the Catholic priest. I mean, you look at Sandusky, let's go back. Sandusky, who molested the boys, and how upset everybody was, and locker room chatter about, oh my God, this coach raping these boys. And you're upset about the Catholic priest. But our biggest crime of all, the last taboo, is happening in our family courts where the children are not being protected. That's the biggest. And it is lack of education. It goes back to misogyny. It goes back to lots of different reasons that this is happening. But equal rights for women, we're not equal. If we can't keep our children safe, how equal are we? I know any woman out there fighting for equal pay or to be equal in any way, if you took their children from them, you'll see how they'll be the equal. They're not even close to being equal when you go into court. They're not.
Do you have any suggestions for these women, advice?
Yes, I say, first of all, you have to have a really good attorney. And if you are in a domestic violence relationship where you're being abused in that kind of a way, you need an attorney that deals with domestic violence cases and understands how the courts are relating to this and really knows how to fight it. Not somebody that just says, I saw a woman across the street once that was abused, and I get this stuff. No, you need somebody that's a fighter. That's number one. Number two, you may have to train that attorney somewhat with what's happening in the system here, because they're blindsided too. And women that are going through this with all their documentation and stuff, I believe, they get to a point because they're so financially depleted. You go to court for year after year with this, or even 1 year, they're depleted financially. They're having to pay all court costs. They're having to pay child support. They're having to pay for everything because they're pretty much punished for fighting this direction for their child. So I say to them, get your ducks in a row. I would take my child to an advocacy center and make sure she got into an advocacy center where they do multidisciplinary training. They know how to do a forensic interview, and you have everything on tape right from the beginning so nothing gets messed up. If you do have to notify somebody, I suggest the police, but an investigative type report. Don't don't think you're going to be able to protect that child like you think you can. I think it's really important to have money set there to be able to fight. And if you don't have the money, you're going to have to be really vocal, and you're really going to have to fight. It's not a lot of these women end up representing themselves, okay, because they're out of money. And I find that, because they know their case better than anybody, not that they want to represent themselves. They would much rather have an attorney representing them, but they're having to represent themselves, and they're doing a good job because they know their case better than anybody. But if you get in there and you don't know how to file or what motion to file, and you're caught up in the system, you can't get out, and you're not strong enough to do that or articulate enough, they don't make it. And if they end up in supervised visits, those go on for years. So you really want to have, I'd say the first move would be to document everything. Do not just one little claim of something, oh, I think my child's being abused. No, you better know that child's being abused.
Wow. So in this difficult situation, what do you think is going to happen to these children who are not protected by the courts and end up living with these abusers?
Deborah, I know what's happening because I watched my own daughter go through it. The trauma is out of this world. It's like one of the number one traumas. You're forcing a child to live in that trauma. So obviously, they know by the research that's been done is how the brain changes, the frontal lobe of the brain. It affects their brain. It affects how they can study, how they can function. They have to compartmentalize so many things to survive what they're having to survive. And trauma that causes so many, well, we know from the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences, Dr. Vincent Paletti did a study in the 80s, and it shows the scale of 1 to 10 of where you are on a scale. And these children that have high scale, like 9 or 8, that have been, subject to divorce or subject to sexual abuse or subject to domestic violence, and all of it adds up. The cost to society is phenomenal. We're talking billions. And I mean, one study showed $500 billion a year we put out, and that's health costs, because this does affect their health. It affects their heart. It affects everything. So yeah, I say we really need to take a bigger look at the bigger picture of this as a society as a whole. When you say, I know people will say, well, I'm not around that, and that's not happened to me. I'm not seeing that. I don't believe there's that much of it. There is that much of it. It's in epidemic numbers. It's just not here in the U.S. It's international as well. I get calls internationally all the time. The same kind of crime going on where children are not being protected and women are not being believed.
Well, I really appreciate your sharing all this with our audience. I know that many of them have already contacted me about similar issues and will be eager to hear your firsthand account and all that you do for it. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to say that perhaps I haven't asked or you haven't mentioned yet?
Well, I would suggest that you have them look at my book, number one, for the research and the legal. Give it to a judge, give it to a lawyer, give it to a therapist. Get it out there in the sense that, and read it, so you're prepared, so you're not so blindsided. There's certain directions you can go in there and statements that will help you because you'll know where you are in that book. And I think it's really important. Other than that, if you're strong enough to, even if you're not a survivor of this or a mother going through it or a child going through it, we need all women to band together and all the good men. I'm not against men. I love men, and I am a feminist, but the bottom line is the good men need to come forward. We need all those good men to take a step forward and say, we don't agree with what's happening here, and this can't continue.
I see. Can you tell us the name of the book and where people could find it, please?
Yes, sure. It's Prosecuted But Not Silenced, Courtroom Reform for Sexually Abused Children, but you can just go by Prosecuted But Not Silenced. My name is Maralee McClean. It's MARALEE. McClean is MCLEAN.com is my website. And you can buy the book at bookstores, Barnes & Noble, Amazon. And there's more information on my website if you need more information of what's happening. And that's MaraleeMcClean.com, like I just said.
Thank you so much. Audience, you have tools and resources in this difficult situation. And Maralee, thank you for sharing your story and what you're doing about it. Wishing you all the best in your endeavors.
Well, thank you for having me.
Pleasure.
Yes, we need everybody's help out there on this subject. I hope this is the next matter that gets before the media so we can change what's happening, because it's just so devastating. Anyway, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
A pleasure. And thank you, audience, for tuning in.